Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology, doing a classic episode of R&T here, joined by Erick Ybarra and William Albrecht. Let's start with Erick. Erick, how you been?
I've been great, man. It's great to be back. This is a classic. It feels like jumping back into like my favorite car, like the 1991 Toyota MR2. The nostalgia of getting back into the old days feels good.
For me, it was
Thank
a Bronco 2. That was my first vehicle. Bronco 2. Good to see you. Looks like you're looking really lean there.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't like chart my progress, but I've kind of told people on social media I've on a pretty clean diet for about a year and a half, been hitting the weights for like 6 months.
Yeah.
So I'm happy with the results, and still got a long way to go, but I'm happy.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm really excited for you. Yeah, you can certainly tell it's paying off.
Oh yeah.
William, welcome back. How are you?
I'm doing great, brother, and even better now that I'm here with my two brothers. I mean, I don't know how long it's been, but it feels like it was yesterday.
Been really a little while. Yeah.
I
had the chance to come on your show a few weeks ago, and that was really fun. We got to
a great blast.
Chop it up and talk about all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, that was a blast. And I got to say, great seeing both of y'all. You both look great. Erick, you look great. Keep up whatever you're doing. Michael, you look great.
Thank you, man.
Michael, why do you still have that fake cardboard bookshelf behind you?
Because I can't afford to buy actual books.
Right.
Or read them.
Brothers, I gotta say, I am thrilled and I'm pumped to be with you all here. Glad to be back, the team back together, and happy about it. And hey, thrilled with whatever comes our way. And God willing, may the Lord preserve us together for a long, long time. Glad to be with you both.
Amen.
Yeah, great to have both of y'all, and appreciate everybody there in the live chat. A lot of people are excited there in the live chat reading through y'all's comments, so that's really cool. So we're talking about the papacy, divine office or human institution. This has been coming up, in all sorts of circles where you have various Catholic and Orthodox dialogues, but also Catholic and Protestant dialogues. And so the topic comes up pretty often. And so perhaps we could talk here about maybe the biblical foundations that establishes an argument for the divine office as opposed to a human institution for the papacy, and also maybe even some patristic and conciliar sources that can be attested to that might be in favor of the Catholic position on this topic. So I'm just kind of throwing it out. We're being pretty broad here, and we can just kind of take it wherever we want and make it as conversational as possible. So, either one of y'all feel free to jump in at any point in time. But let me maybe start with you, Erick. What are some general thoughts that you have here? I mean, you've looked into the papacy and studied it for years. You have a book on the papacy specifically. You do cover this very topic. In fact, I would say it's very much central to your book on the papacy. What are some things that you've seen both in favor of the notion that this is a divine institution, and also some challenges, some challenges to that thesis as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a great topic. A lot of it depends on who we're addressing. So if we're addressing the Eastern, we'll address Eastern Orthodox Protestants, and then perhaps maybe if we have time, atheists. But if we're addressing the Eastern Orthodox, we come with a great deal of equipment because we don't have the scripture. We have the patristic tradition and the ecumenical councils basically garner the rule for how to interpret scripture when it makes those references to the texts of Peter's primacy. But for the Orthodox, what we could start with is saying, look, Catholics and Orthodox believe that Jesus Christ created a government for the church. This is something that distinguishes us from Protestants, even amongst those magisterial Protestants who were adamant about the church government. I mean, Presbyterian polity, Baptist polity, everybody believes in government, but Catholics and Orthodox believe specifically in apostolic succession, and so do Anglicans, but we have a specific dynamic that gives this sense of perpetuity and unity. And so the Orthodox have no problem believing that the apostolate that Jesus created is basically the foundation of the episcopate. So whatever was created in the apostolate is going to continue in the episcopate. And if inside the apostolate there is an individual who was given unique prerogatives, then it would stand to reason that in the episcopate there is one who will be possessed of those unique prerogatives as well. And so going to scripture, we see these individualistic promises and prerogatives given to Peter in the classical Petrine texts, Matthew 16, Luke 23, and John 20, chapter 20, where Christ is said to be the rock of the church, but more importantly, excuse me, more importantly, he's given the keys of the kingdom to himself. And, you know, the Greek grammar there, it signifies whether, you know, the Aramaic, it would have been in both senses, to Peter alone. Of course, you know, we know in 2 chapters later, all the apostles get a share in this binding and loosing powers. But Peter is definitely given this role as like a doorkeeper or a gatekeeper. And we see that he's made shepherd of the sheep, and that Peter alone given the promise of his faith not failing. And this assignment, this pastoral assignment to strengthen the brethren. And for the Orthodox, this is very, very fortunate, because for the Protestants, there's a range of options as to what these things can mean. But for the Orthodox, you can go to the ecumenical councils and see how they delineate those Petrine commissions to the bishops of Rome. And when you do that, it's pretty clear that the primacy of Peter in Scripture equals the primacy of Rome in the episcopate until the end of time. So that's for the Orthodox.
Until the end of time. That might be the key, because I think some Orthodox would concede that Rome held that primacy, but they would say that has been transferred to perhaps Constantinople or Moscow. And so maybe speak to how the transferability argument is not necessarily possible.
Yeah, that's a great one. So really all we need is patristic testimony to the belief that this is permanently stationary. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't go. It doesn't transfer. It doesn't have a transitory character. You know, transitory character would be something that could be here in one time and in another place in another time. Part of the patristic testimony is that the prerogatives of Peter were permanently stationed in Rome, such that even if a bishop of Rome if he forfeits the office, you know, some people say, well, what happens in, you know, Revelation chapter 2 and 3, where it says that bishops can become heretics, and what happens Romans 11, where Paul says that if you don't stand firm in the faith, you'll lose your place inside the stock. Well, even if a bishop of Rome were to get up and to decide, you know, I'm going to be a Muslim and I'm done with this, that doesn't mean the prerogatives of the office are gone, because there's a supernatural deposit of Peter's government in the environs of the ecclesial atmosphere in Rome, in the city church of Rome. And so that stays there. And we see that in the Council of Ephesus 31. You guys know this well. It's like a dream now, right? But
Philip the Legate,
it's explicitly stated that it says that Celestine, Bishop of Rome at the time, in due succession. So it's not even just succession, it's lawful succession both now and forever, judges in his successors. We see that come up again in Constantinople III, Nicaea II with Hadrian's letters, and various supports from Byzantine saints speak to that very element of perpetuity and permanency. And I think that gets to the question right there, is the permanency of the location. So we don't ever get anything. We don't ever get anybody saying that it's possible to go somewhere else.
Now, in this discussion about patristic witness and also conciliar witnesses that you just brought up there, Philip the Legate at Ephesus, and of course you have some instances with Agatho and the Sixth Ecumenical Council and Hadrian at the Seventh, and so those that you just mentioned. What would you say in response to others will point out patristic and maybe even more conciliar witnesses that would suggest that the Pope can teach heresy, of course, the Sixth Ecumenical Council with Honorius, and they would say, see, the Roman See can defect from the faith, and in fact did defect in the case of Honorius, and therefore it could be transferred. So all these other passages and maybe patristic witnesses that you're referencing, maybe you're just misunderstanding them in light of this other data that seems to lend to this other thesis. Well, what would you say in response to that?
Well, first of all, I would highly welcome it, right? Because we're all trying to deal with this faithfully and scientifically. We don't want to shy away from what technicians can observe, right? We want to get technical and we want to be practical. So what I would say is, first of all, we might come up against a brick wall like Honorius, the situation where it's like, what happens in this case? The council says that the Pope was they accuse him and his 2 letters to Sergius as execrable. Worthy of burning, right?
Yeah.
What I would say is, okay, let's note that down. Let's write it down.
Sure.
But let's do some Protestants and Orthodox do, where they throw everything else off the table, and the story of Honorius is the only object on the table.
Right.
Okay. So we have to keep everything on the table. So let's keep the Honorius tragedy there, but then let's also look at the Agatho triumph, which is the letter of Agatho, which is that there is divinity that is protecting the Roman See, specifically in the department of teaching. So you've got 2 things that are on the table, and so you take one and then pretend like the others are invisible. Mm-hmm. You either have to come up with a way to resolve tension, you've explained so well over the years, Michael, or you walk away from the table. And don't pretend like you're sitting at the table. Yeah, if you're going to share the table with us, we've got to work with what's on the table. And we don't get the benefit of invisibility just because we decide that. So I would say that it is a little bit unfortunate that the Sixth Council did not have a light bulb go off and say, hey, we just said that we accept Pope Agatho's letter, which says that the Apostolic See is infallible from the beginning unto the end, the very supernatural power of Christ, and then we also condemned one of those who chaired the see,
And it's more complex than that. It's actually more complex. Let me point this out, and I want to get your thoughts, and then I want to transition over here and get William to jump in. Let me ask you one other point. Speaking about this, so in that same letter with Agatho, not only is he testifying to the indefectibility of the teaching authority of Rome, but he even says all of his predecessors have held to that promise. Yes. And one of those predecessors is Honorius. Yep. And of course, the council accepts that. So they in theory accept that Honorius was free from deviation, was free from heresy, free from the stain of teaching error because of this indefectible promise of Jesus. They affirm that, and then they go and condemn him and anathematize him as a heretic. So it leaves a question for both Catholics and Orthodox. Did
Right.
the council contradict itself, or is there a way to harmonize this? What are your thoughts here?
Right. So I think we've got, if there's anybody left at the table, who wants to resolve this Rubik's cube, there are a few options. I find myself toggling. Sometimes I'm this one, sometimes I'm another one. But I think that a good resolution would be, and perhaps they didn't have the foresight to make these distinctions at the time, and that's fine. But Pope Honorius was not exercising the full properties that will activate the very promises that were being used to describe the Roman See. And so this is one of the reasons why over time there have been those distinctions made between just regular teaching, like a bishop of Rome writing a letter to a few bishops or to a province or to a king or versus something like an edictatorial encyclical to the whole church under pain of ecclesiastical suicide. And if you reject it, that you'll be excommunicated. Of course, when you read Honorius's letter, the grade of its posture is lowered the more you study it. You see he's more hesitant than he is assertive. And you know this, Michael, but William, but some of the listeners, unfortunately, the books to read Honorius's letters translated in English, the book is like $175. But I think you can get it for free online somewhere. But I think it's in a book on Sophronius, of Jerusalem, the Christology of Sophronius of Jerusalem.
Yep.
You could read the letters of Sergius to Honorius, and then you could also read some of the letters of Sophronius himself, and then also of Honorius to Sergius. And you'll see, if somebody has the patience and the time, Honorius comes very far from like Leo's home or Agatho's letter to the council or Pope Hormisdas, Adrian's letters. You'll know in that session in Nicaea II, where they list what are the attributes for an ecumenical council. They say, well, the Council of Hieria, 754, it didn't have the Bishop of Rome,
right,
nor did it have an encyclical from him. So they already knew that there was this specific department for a conciliar letter from.
Yeah.
And Honorius's letters don't come to that. They don't come to that value. So that's one resolution, is that, a pope exercising his magisterium in a lower level like that, he could crash the plane like that. And that's it's not a great thing. It hurts. We got to admit that it hurts the Pope, it hurts the people who are influenced by him. But it doesn't arise to a contradiction to the Catholic system.
Yeah, I think, however, the difficulty is some people in the chat are trying to downgrade it and just say, well, look, it wasn't ex cathedra. But I think it's more complex than that, because the letter specifies that the indefectibility of Rome isn't just like limited to some kind of ex cathedra qualification. He talks about the see, the teaching office, which would encompass ordinary magisterium, at least in later thought. Perhaps he's not being specific enough. Perhaps we have to read some distinctions and nuances and qualifications into it. And that might be legit, but I do think that we have to do that. Now, when I've attempted to harmonize it, I've said very similar to what you've said here, and that is, maybe we're having to look at some of these more recent qualifications to the papacy that we've outlined for the magisterium, and we're having to read that into here. And those could be legitimate ways to harmonize the conflict. But be that as it may, we do recognizably have to read those distinctions into the text, and that's 100% admitted. However, the alternative would be, Well, the Council Fathers just contradicted themselves and their own ecclesiology.
Right.
And I don't
Right.
know if anybody really wants to affirm that, because they're not
No.
just contradicting themselves on a matter of fact, whether the person of Honorius is a heretic. They would be contradicting themselves on the claim that the See of Rome is indefectible.
Yes.
They would be contradicting
those are
their
divine
own
claims.
ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Yeah, those are
if they're-
claims about divine activity.
Exactly. And if they're contradicting that, that's a doctrinal claim that they're undermining. And therefore, if they're contradicting their own ecclesiology, they could also be faulty in their Christology.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing collapses at that point. And so my thing is, this is a difficulty for everyone involved. I can see a
Right.
possible harmonization for the Catholic side. I cannot see a way to reconcile this for Eastern Orthodox. And I've
No.
long hammered this home that I think you can make sense of this from the Catholic perspective. I don't see how you can make sense of this from Eastern Orthodoxy. William, I want to get you to jump in. You've been hanging out there in the back. What do you think?
I'm with you 100% there, and to kind of dial it back a little bit, I want to go to the Bible, and then I want to get to where Eric and you went. And Eric brought it up. He brought up multiple the classical passages: Matthew 16:18, Luke 22, John 21. Now, for me, let me be very clear, Michael and Eric. I believe the Orthodoxy do face a dilemma when we look at the Bible, at the Fathers and the Councils. And I want to, of course, as you know, the dialogue really is couched in the first millennium. That's pretty much what we're dealing with when we're dialoguing with them on this particular issue. And I do think that you run into a great issue within the world of Eastern Orthodoxy. When we look at the Bible in particular, these are foundational texts. They're very, very important. And I think that very often the Orthodox begin with going right at Honorius, Vigilius, the usual suspects right away. And a lot of the times there's such a dismissal of the Bible to where, and you know this, Michael, because you in your book, Answering Orthodoxy, which I've got on my shelf, you pointed out that a lot of the times in the realm of Orthodoxy, there's a right away kind of like a going and hammering at the famous figures in history, and all the while ignoring what the Bible says. Look, if we begin with the Bible right away from the beginning, you've got to, whether you're Eastern Orthodox, and I'm gonna include my Oriental friends here as well, you have to accept that Peter's role was uniquely foundational. There is no way around that at all. And not only uniquely foundational, divinely instituted. In no way had any other apostle shared. That was unique. The Fathers recognize this. Councils recognize this. And my issue is, when we then look at Orthodoxy, what is going on if you are lacking that visible head that was present all throughout church history, beginning in the Bible? And then we look at how the early fathers interpreted those texts in a particular manner. And I think that at the end of the day, really only the Catholic Church is able to say, okay, well, we have upheld this as stinky as history can get down the line. We do have the Vicar of Christ. We do have St. Peter. And I think that when we look at the claims of Eastern Orthodoxy, when they go to Honorius and they go into history, at the end of the day, Michael, you bring up a very good point. It isn't, and I've always cringed at the idea that, well, I'm going to just sweep it under the rug. It wasn't ex cathedra. No, you got to really deal with it. Steel man the argument from the other side and recognize that, okay, was Honorius a heretic? And if he was, what then are the ramifications for the opposite of the papacy? Did the council get it wrong? What happened here? At the end of the day, what we do know, as Eric pointed out, when dealing with Honorius, the council recognizes that that office remains indefectible and always will. And the important thing is that is a council held by East and West in common with us. They hold that. They've got to agree to those claims, Eric. How do you deal with those claims? Now, I know the argument, as Michael brought up, of transferability. That argument isn't only used by the Eastern Orthodox. You know that, Eric. That'll be used by Oriental Orthodox friends as well. I am of the opinion that you can look at Ephesus and extrapolate papal supremacy there as well. The claims made there of the papacy are very, very of an elevated nature. And you look at them in perpetuity as well. Now, our Oriental friends say that, well, you've heard this, Eric and Michael, by means of abandoning the Miaphysite Christology of Ephesus, that there's that transferability. They've lost this divine prerogative, if you will, in some kind of a manner. I don't think that works at all. First off, I don't think that we're so far apart in Christology as people thought many centuries back. We had that joint declaration on Christology. I don't think Christology should be such a massive barrier between us. But getting back to the issue, the papal claims aren't only there later in history. They're there very early on. They're present in the Bible. Early church history, we can look at Pope Clement of Rome, the manner in which he wrote in an authoritative manner. Then we can look in the early councils, and I particularly emphasize Ephesus because that is before the split between Oriental and Catholic, and of course Eastern Orthodox. But Ephesus has very powerful papal language as well. And then, of course, Chalcedon does as well, and then later councils. As you mentioned, Constantinople III, Nicaea II, Hadrian, and what have you. I think that there is a dilemma on the other side. That dilemma is that when we look at the Bible, we look at the early fathers, and we look at the ecumenical councils, and we hold to ourselves to the first millennium in terms of the papacy. Even if we want to say Catholicism has had a shaky history, we've had some bad popes and a lot of phenomenal ones. Either which way, I think the dilemma is on the side of the Eastern Orthodox, because we look at the fathers and the councils, and they agree to the papal prerogatives. Eric and Michael, you both know that. They agree to those papal prerogatives for centuries. What I am witnessing today, over and over on their side, is a kind of revisionism that to me is a shocking revisionism, to reread these texts to then say, well, that's Byzantine flattery. That's mere flattery. Well, perpetuity doesn't mean perpetuity. To the end of time doesn't mean to the end of time. Eric, you heard that in your debate with Ubi, and I'm very well aware of that. But you, as you pointed out brilliantly, well, what kind of language is being used? It's hearkening to this particular kind of language. It has got to mean in perpetuity. I have never heard a good answer from the other side with the papal claims at the councils. Because we can look at Matthew, we could look at Matthew 16, Luke 22, John 21. When we look at how the fathers interpreted them and the ecumenical councils, they interpret them in a very Catholic manner. That to me is where the dilemma will be on the Orthodox side. Now, I think there's a lot we agree upon. And as you pointed out, there's a whole lot we agree upon. And there's a lot of fathers we can look at where the Orthodox, as Michael knows very well, can say, well, yeah, we agree with that language. We have no issue with that. We agree with that language. But can you truly agree with the papal prerogatives laid out, the power of the office laid out in the councils? I truly do not believe that they can. I don't. And as one that I came from Protestantism. I'm a convert. I looked at both Orthodoxy and Catholicism for a while before I chose Catholicism. The papacy was a big issue for me. Ultimately, I found that the way the church functioned throughout the centuries, because you got to look at, notice how I went to the Bible in the beginning. You're looking in the Bible in the beginning, but you don't only look at the Bible, you look at how the early church lived and operated and functioned as a church. And when you look at how that church functioned, you've got these particular prerogatives of the Bishop of Rome. And to me, that's very, very powerful. Then you've got the fathers that witness to Roman primacy. And you know very well, these fathers that we can point to are revered by the Orthodox. They have them and they share them in communion with us as saints. They affirm Roman preeminence, headship, and universal authority, not just a kind of honor or a seniority, as you've heard these arguments over and over. So my issue then is we look at these, and gentlemen, we haven't even gotten to the Protestants yet. We're talking a lot about the Orthodox.
Yeah, Orthodox right now.
You're right. We're talking a lot about the Orthodox, but in particular, talking about the Orthodox, my main point is this. There is that historical acceptance of papal prerogatives. That, to me, cannot be denied. You have bishops routinely appealing to Rome to settle disputes. You've got that all throughout history. And historically, the East acknowledged the Pope as more than merely a first among equals. They sought out his confirmation. They recognized his judgments, submitted synodal acts for Roman approval. And I can go on and on. That, to me, puts them in a dilemma. Well, what do I mean by a dilemma? The Bible lays out Petrine primacy. The fathers consistently exalt Rome, recognize Petrine primacy as well, and then we get to the height of it, the ecumenical councils, they reaffirm papal jurisdiction. So to me, you run into a big problem. Looking at the title of the show, it's a great title, by the way, Michael, Divine Office or Human Tradition. The papacy is a divine office, and it's passed on in succession to the Bishop of Rome. And to me, if you deny that, then you are then in a difficult position that I would say is an untenable position, because you are then historically and theologically inconsistent. Now, we know that our Protestant friends are, but if you want to remain faithful to your own tradition, the Orthodox are faced with a choice. You're either going to have to reinterpret, as they do, these very clear and early testimonies to Roman primacy, or ultimately return to communion with the successor of Peter. And ultimately, the latter is what I think would be the best for them. Those are my particular thoughts. One thing that I don't think got put on the table here, and I think maybe I'll kind of stir it up with you guys. I'll stir it up. I want y'all's opinion. Was Honorius a heretic?
Well, and yeah, let's get to that, but also related to this. Let me bring up the text. I know y'all know the text, but the audience may not. So let's just demonstrate this to them and show them the difficulty for everyone involved, Catholics and Orthodox, and we're going to tackle the question of whether he was a heretic. So here's Agatho writing to the emperor. It's read out loud at the council. The council accepts the letter. They think it's the bee's knees. They love it. They think it's divinely inspired. When they wrote back to Agatho. And so they affirm what's being stated in here. They don't say any of this is heretical. Now, what Agatho is trying to do is he's trying to say, look, because the Roman See is indefectible in its teaching office, because it never errs from the path of apostolic tradition, I get to tell you this Christological doctrine. I get to tell you what my view is, and I get to tell you that monothelitism is wrong. And they accept that. But watch what he does here. He talks about how the Apostolic Church of Christ, in the context that is the Church of Rome, you'll see that here in just a second, has never erred from the path of the apostolic tradition. Now, the difficulty, however, would be is if we're just going to say this is only ex cathedra teachings. Well, look, he's saying the See has never erred from the path of apostolic tradition and never yielded to heretical innovations. If you're going to say that, well, maybe he was teaching in his ordinary magisterium heresy, but not ex cathedra, I think that's too simplistic. I don't think that either one of y'all are saying that, but I think some people might argue that. I think that's too simplistic because he's arguing for something broader with indefectibility. He's saying the See itself doesn't yield to heretical innovations. And I think that some people would read that as including the ordinary magisterium. Now, others might not, but I think they would have to read that distinction into the text and severely limit this promise to just like ex cathedra teachings only, which may be a possibility, but I think you really have to read it in there, and there might be some challenges. But he's saying, look, this is based on a divine promise. He explicitly says it's a divine promise from Jesus, not from a council, but from Jesus. He says it's from the promise, Peter, behold, Satan has desired to have you that he might sift you as wheat, but I pray for you that your faith fail not. And then he applies that to the papacy, and he says, this promise is to Peter's faith and his successors. And then he goes on to note that all of the popes, even my predecessors, which would include Honorius, have always confidently done this very thing. Done what? Never yielded to heretical innovations. And notice the big thing here. He's saying that the See, the apostolic See, remains undefiled unto the end. And so it's not that it's just had a good track record up until this council. It will be undefiled unto the end, not just because it's really good at guessing doctrine, but rather because of a divine promise. And so the difficulty is he's saying the Roman See never defected from the faith, never, yielded to heretical innovations. And he's even saying my predecessors have been in keeping with this, but who's one of his predecessors? Honorius. Yep. Now, the same council that accepts this a few sessions later, for various reasons, condemns Honorius as a heretic and anathematizes him. So there's a difficulty involved for everyone. For the Catholic, it is how, number one, how does one accept the notion that the apostolic see is undefiled unto the end, with the notion that Honorius was condemned as a heretic. Also, for the Catholic, how does one explain that even Honorius here is claimed to be in keeping with the promise of being undefiled unto the end, and yet he's also condemned in the same council a few sessions later? That's the challenge on the Catholic side. For the Orthodox, it's obvious. The claim that a pope could be a heretic, that's in line with what they say. However, the notion that the apostolic see will be undefiled unto the end because of a divine promise, and that that Honorius was in keeping with that, that's a problem for them. Because number one, is their council contradicting itself on a judgment about Honorius? And number two, how in the world can you accept the doctrinal and ecclesial assertion that Rome's apostolic teaching authority is undefiled unto the end? That's a doctrinal statement that I think is fundamentally incompatible with Eastern Orthodoxy, because this is the seeds of papal infallibility. Once you've conceded this right here, this papal dogma, you've left Eastern Orthodoxy and you've effectively become an Eastern Catholic. So I think this is actually a greater difficulty for Eastern Orthodox, because I do think from the Catholic perspective, you can basically say that whenever Agatho is saying that even his predecessors were undefiled unto the end, he's talking about the teaching authority of the papal office. However, later on, when Honorius is condemned, he's being condemned for manifesting heresy in some lesser degree that doesn't rise to the level of teaching authority. There's some difficulty, however, even with that thesis, as I've pointed out, because you do have, as Erick has pointed out, from the Acts of Constantinople IV, you do have the Acts saying that Honorius taught heresy. So now you have to read that as, okay, is he teaching that in his magisterium, or is this just some kind of figure of speech of he taught this in some kind of non-official capacity? Either way, everyone involved is going to have to read some premises into the data, because the data itself, I think, can be read in multiple ways. However, I think the data itself lends itself more to Catholicism than it does Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah. It puts you into the medieval debates of the West, away from Eastern Orthodoxy, and at worst you could be a conciliarist. You could try to be a conciliarist, a Gallicanist, a Febroniist, a Josephine. You could try going that route. Of course, that is riddled with problems. I think I've seen somebody on Twitter who is he follows Jacques Bossuet, French Gallican, that he believed in papal infallibility, but he believed that it was only in concilia with the episcopate. But that still gets you away from Eastern Orthodoxy. That's what you've identified here are tensions that, in fact, pointing out the tensions is a pro-Catholic argument, because it shows that where you have a tension, you have Catholicism, but where you have an utter contradiction, you have Eastern Orthodoxy. So where do you want to be? Do you want to be in the room where you have a tension, or do you want to be in the room where you have an about face contradiction?
Can I briefly comment?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly. I wanted to, as you laid out that text, Michael, it hit me yet again. The Orthodox dilemma again. When we look at Constantinople III, we look at the text, and as you pointed out, you have infallibility of the apostolic see right there, and laid out and based right there the way that it interprets Luke 22. Luke 22 is a phenomenal text, and we have right there the divine protection promised to Peter's faith. Now, when we look at what I've barely called the Orthodox dilemma right now, but the Orthodox tradition, you look at it and it's in tension. It is in a kind of tension, as Erick alluded to right now, because of the rejection of Roman primacy and papal infallibility. they're going to have to argue, and this is where you've got a big dilemma they're in. They're going to have to argue that the promise of Christ in Luke 22 was temporary, and that's contrary to the conciliar declaration. Or they're going to argue, which we know they do as well, that the apostolic see later lost this kind of charism of indefectibility, but that's against the claim as well. That is against
incompatible
what the
with the
council
idea.
says.
The whole idea of the charism is
Yeah.
that you would lose it.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but you run into many dilemmas either which way you go. If you try, and I'm trying to steelman their very best arguments, a temporal promise contrary to the conciliar declaration. They lost that charism at some point in time. That is against the conciliar claim as well. Either which way you turn, you are in a dilemma.
Yes, and you also brought up the question: was Honorius a heretic? That's another topic we need to briefly explore here.
Yes.
So it just appears to me that what he was intending to say, according to I believe his secretary, Honorius' secretary, and as well as other popes like Pope John IV, who wrote an apology for Honorius, as well as Maximus the Confessor, it appears that what he was saying when he spoke of one will was not that Jesus only has absolutely speaking one will, but rather that his human will was not in conflict with concupiscence or anything like that. In the way that we would say our human will is in conflict with our fleshly nature, with our fleshly desires, I should say. Jesus didn't have that. It appears that that's what he's talking about. So it looks like, no, he wasn't a heretic and wasn't espousing that, although he did want to shut down the discussion on the question of, is there one or two wills? And perhaps that wasn't a very prudent move. But it doesn't look like he held to a heretical position, but that does still raise the difficulty. Did the council throw him under the bus and misjudge him? What do y'all think?
Well, I think that it raises the question, and this may not be a question that our Orthodox friends are willing to entertain, of whether a council can gather the wrong facts and come to the wrong conclusion on a subject that is exterior to strictly faith and morals.
Faith and morals,
So already, Maximus the Confessor, before the council of 681, Maximus Confessor, he had some later defenses of Honorius. He always defended Honorius.
Mm-hmm.
But one of his defenses was that you guys, can you hear me?
You've been cutting out most of the time. I don't know if you're able to exit and come back in. Are you using Wi-Fi right now?
Yeah, I'm using Wi-Fi.
Is there any way you could hardwire? If not, that's okay. Could you maybe disconnect the router and reconnect it and rejoin us? Let's see if that helps any. Sometimes if you just do a reboot of everything, try that. And me
So William, you go ahead, and then I'll come back.
And William, you brought up a point there about scripture, and this kind of ties into the question about Protestantism. When the Sixth Ecumenical Council is referencing there, Peter, Satan has desired to sift you like wheat. I think that from a Protestant's perspective, they might just say, look, that's eisegesis. That's just reading way too much into the text. It's talking about Peter. It's not talking about his successors. And it's not talking about some notion of papal infallibility. It's talking about him not falling away absolutely and apostatizing indefinitely. And so I think a Protestant exegete would probably not be impressed by the interpretation that the council is offering. But on the flip side, I would point out, but that kind of reading into the text is some of the same stuff that you find New Testament writers doing with the Old Testament. So if you're going to say this is illegitimate for the council, I think you have to indict the New Testament writers, which obviously a Protestant is not going to want to do. So then they're going to have to say, perhaps there are some methods of interpretation that could be pretty loose here. And if that's the case, okay, then that makes some space for the interpretation that the council is producing here. What do you think about that?
I think it's a great point, Michael, and I think it's a completely different position you have to take when dialoguing with our evangelical friends. They are not going to be impressed with the papal language of council. They don't care. They don't care. They believe those are later deviations from the pristine truth that is preserved in the Bible alone. So even if you show them early fathers, okay, well, in the Bible, there were already factions. People were already going astray. I am not impressed by Pope Clement of Rome. It's something they might say. Ultimately, what you've got to point out is, how does the Bible lay out the role of the divinely instituted office of St. Peter? And when we look at that, we recognize that that office isn't meant to just end there at the very end of the life of St. Peter. If that were the case, we wouldn't have them scrambling to fill the bishopric in the book of Acts, chapter 1 in particular. They are filling the office after people that are part of the office die off. They die, they look to fill that office and put somebody else in there, because they know the church is meant to continue. The church isn't going to stop acting, living, and breathing. With that in mind, we tell our evangelical friends, well, look, in the book of Acts, we've got the church in action. And when they have to settle a doctrinal dispute, do Gentile converts have to be circumcised? Well, that isn't a minor issue. That is a big issue, Michael. You know that. That's touching upon salvation. That's touching upon grace. That is the heart of the gospel, as they'll say. What you have there is you have a council that gathers with a clear hierarchical order. That is what St. John Chrysostom believed, St. Jerome. And there's a leader who resolves that matter. We've got Peter who stands up. He speaks definitively. And the council recognizes his decision. James speaks next, but he defers. And that's very clear there. We can say, well, look, to our evangelical friends, there is clearly this kind of primacy that the office has, that Peter has. He speaks first, resolves the debate, and he has the precedent of the Cornelius event in particular. That comes in Acts 8 or Acts 9. And he's not corrected or voted down. And right there you have the precedent, the model for the church. That is an essential model, because if the church is facing a doctrinal crisis, you've got the chief shepherd who can preserve unity, who can settle doctrine. And then we read one chapter later, Michael and Eric, one chapter later after Acts 15, when they go out into the rest of the world to pass upon this declaration. That declaration is a decision that is binding in all. It's called a dogmata. A dogmata. That declaration, and that shows us we've got a council that is modeled around what we can say the early kernel of the Catholic position, what we believe is to be a divinely instituted office. We can tell our evangelical friends, look, the basis is there in the Bible. The church continues as it's meant to continue. How else are they going to fulfill the divine commission of going out and baptizing all nations? And we've got to have these offices continue, and they do continue throughout history. So yeah, I think it's a completely different position you got to take when you talk to your Protestant friends. Very different position. But either which way, I believe that they run into that dilemma, because we've got to, laid out per the Bible, we've got a particular model of hierarchy of leadership, and that hierarchical model then comes into play in the early church, and we have an ability to be able to say we can look in the Bible and have this precedent for it. And I think that the Protestant dilemma is a real one as well. But I want to return to the Honorius thing now that Eric is back. It looks like, Eric, you're crisp and sharp now.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah. I think it's working again.
Did that make sense, Michael? Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and that I think helps for the evangelical perspective. But I do want to get back to the question, especially focusing on Eastern Orthodoxy here. I don't know, Eric, if you want to offer any more comments on Honorius, but if you do, if you could offer those, and then also let's tackle the question of Vigilius, because this one is coming up more and more often. If you can maybe walk through, the audience through just kind of a rundown of what happened with Vigilius, where he's seemingly contradicting himself and using pretty solemn language and Petrine language in apparently conflicting ways, and how that works in conjunction with the council apparently suspending him, and how that then works with the Catholic claims, if you can walk through that.
Yeah. Well, on Honorius, I would say that there's also a difficulty for the Orthodox, because the Sixth Council condemned everyone who defended Honorius's letters, whether they were alive or dead. And Maximus is one of those guys. And I brought this point out to some of my Orthodox friends, and then they start to make distinctions between what Maximus intended.
And where does the council do that, where it condemns even those who defend the letters? Do you know specifically offhand?
I'll have to look. I'm pretty sure I could find it while we're talking.
Yeah, just whenever we get a pause here and me and William are talking, if you could pull that up. But I think that would be fascinating to demonstrate on the screen in light of, again, Maximus the Confessor.
Yeah,
as well as Pope John IV.
Yeah, then you've got John IV, who I mean, he knows. I mean, he was so close. He had the archives there, and he was able to read the letter. Probably knew people who knew Pope Honorius. He was familiar with the conflict, the Christological debates. Were typically more prone to go with the credibility of somebody who's closer to a particular person who's being investigated. And he defends Honorius on this very same grounds as Maximus does. Interestingly enough, at the council, none of these defensive witnesses come up. And one wonders why the papal legates were not prepared, right?
It looks like it was an accident that all of a sudden the emperor was having them read out from a letter, and it was unexpected. This was not anticipated, that Honorius's name would be read and thrown under the bus. But once his name was read, it's like, okay, we got to address the elephant in the room. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
So there's a little bit of an unsolved mystery here, because Agatho prepares for no other person other than Sergius Paul and all the infamous names, right? But Macarius of Antioch, who was in the hot seat at the council, he was like, wait a minute, why am I getting all this heat here? I'm just going with what Honorius said. And so the council included Honorius in the picture. And I wish the papal legates were a little bit as brave as the papal legates at Chalcedon. Because, as everybody knows, at Chalcedon, the legates there were willing to press the brakes on everything.
But here, when they were reading that letter from the Patriarch of Antioch, I don't think the emperor knew the contents of the letter as they were opening it and reading it. They were reading it live, not knowing what was in it. All of a sudden, the Patriarch is saying, but Honorius said it too. And so at that point, oddly enough, they're in this weird, awkward situation where they're like, well, I guess we got to condemn Honorius too. But there was no defense of Honorius. There was no real debate on it, right?
Yeah, and that's really, I mean, I wish we would have had what we know exists, which is at Maximus, who, a lot of people don't realize this, but the Byzantines at the time, they had no respect for Maximus. So, like George of Constantinople, he was the patriarch of Constantinople at the time. Emperor Constantine IV, and the legates from Jerusalem and Antioch. None of these people were fans of Maximus. So it doesn't surprise me that Maximus doesn't come up. Orthodox people today are like, well, why wouldn't they bring up Maximus? Well, you got to remember, Maximus was an enemy of the state for a while. It wasn't for some time before he got into the hagiography of the East. But Pope John IV's letter, it doesn't come up, and that was written to the Easterners as well. But anyway, you also have Anastasius the librarian in the 9th century, who is an archivist, obviously the librarian, we call him. He was very familiar with the texts of the councils. And as a student of these councils, he tells us that there are certain things in a council that are given certain respect as essential, and other things which may have been wrong. And he thinks that the anathema of Honorius was wrong, and that Pope John IV and Maximus pretty much get Honorius, the situation of Honorius, off the table.
And let me ask you a very awkward question, but in relation to this, if a council could get that wrong, Does that maybe explain why in some instances we now see obviously some of the ecumenical councils condemning Nestorius as an Nestorian, and yet in some of the Eastern Catholic churches he's now venerated, in Eastern Catholic circles, seemingly with Rome's approbation. So we're starting to see some of these figures who were condemned by some of the ecumenical councils now venerating in some of these Eastern churches that have preserved a veneration to them but come back into communion, and Rome has allowed it. Could it be that Rome is doing that because of this very distinction, the difference between a council weighing in on matters of faith and morals versus a council weighing in on a particular person? What are your thoughts there?
I do think so. I think that analogous to human sciences, I think over time God has allowed certain observations in the sacred science of theology to become more clear as time goes by. I know that gets a lot of people uncomfortable, but we're all of us are trapped into this. Nobody is released from this. But I think especially when you look at the amount of scholarship that admits that infamous letter of Ibas of Edessa.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
To
You're
Marie,
opening up a can of worms.
to Marie the person. I know we're gonna touch on this, but you will be very hard to find a scholar today. I'm talking about Thomas Grauman. That's the partner who made the commentary for the Liverpool's volume on Ephesus with Price. I mean, some of the leading experts, you won't find anybody who thinks that, that was the letter from the Edessan clergy about Ibas, and that caused persecution. People's lives were. I mean, it's just incredible how unflinchingly fundamentalist some of the early church's consciousness was on how sensitive a council was to error. But I think that now, if we take the breadth of scholarship, we're having to dissect some of these issues. And I think that historical facts, whether we're getting matters of persons correct, their intentions, the way they ended their lives, these are things that are going to have to be relegated to an area that is away from the forum of an ecumenical council, at least on an infallible mode, So, and if an Orthodox really wants to anchor us in for this, we've got a lot of cards to wrap them back with.
Exactly. Especially with the 3 chapters situation.
Yeah, I mean, if we have time and a moderator, we can go through a lot. So I think that the Honorius situation. First of all, does our audience know that he was condemned 40 years after his death?
Right.
Yeah, this is after the fact. Right.
This is a man who fell asleep in the Lord.
And yeah, which is a problem in and of itself, right? Judging somebody who has already gone before the judgment seat, right? There's some difficulty there, but I know we've addressed this a million times, each one of us on our own shows. Pope Leo II qualified that anathema, though, when he confirmed the council. From what I understand, Honorius' anathema is more negligence, but yes, he was called heretic. I think it's more than that. I know some people have tried to read Leo that way. I think there might be a little bit more evidence from Leo. Perhaps y'all can speak to that in a second. But I think forget Leo. If you just look at the Fourth Ecumenical Council, it does say that he taught heresy. So there it's making a greater statement. It's not saying just negligence. The Eighth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople IV, is saying taught heresy. So you have to grapple with that. No matter how the thing shakes down with Leo II, you got a different papally approved ecumenical council that goes further than the negligence claim. So to me, like, this one has just ran out of gas and needs to be retired. I don't know. What do y'all think?
William, you want to go on that one?
Yeah, look, going to that, I agree with you, Michael, 100%. Let me put something else on the table, because Michael, you teased it out, and so did Erick. The idea of whether or not a council can err historically. Can it do that? Now, that is
matters of fact?
Right, in matters of fact. Can it do that? Right.
Yeah, that's what we've been. Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I mean,
And that
I
and,
think
and
Orthodox have to concede that with the 3 chapters
I
situation.
agree. I'm curious as to how some are virtually dogmatic on claiming that it cannot. By the way, that is the position that even the great
The
Dr.
conciliar
Fastigi.
fundamentalism view that
Yes.
Richard Price talks about. Yeah, that to me I've just never been very, very impressed by, because I just don't see
Right.
how it accounts for exactly what Erick's bringing up here with the 3 chapters. I think that if that's
Precisely.
the case, you would not have had a need for the 5th Ecumenical Council.
100%. And I think that I don't think there's a problem being able to say that. There's a clear distinction between a historical issue, an erring historically, and then looking at dogmatic declarations on, let's say, justification, the sacraments. Those are flawless in faith and morals. And I think that there's a very clear difference there. And I think we can say, yes, without a doubt, God guides the council. There's no doubt the church obeys its decision. I think we have a biblical precedence there as well. We can look in Acts 15, which settles the doctrinal issue. And we look and we say, I don't think there's a big issue being able to say that there is perhaps an error historically. And I think that if you argue otherwise, I think then you have got to really twist yourself into a pretzel to make sense of a lot of things, not just this particular issue of Honorius. You know that very well, Michael. There's many issues we can go to.
And let me add to this, since you're bringing it up, and it is a challenge, I think, although I do believe there are some potential solutions here. Not only are some of these historical errors on just matters of fact and a person, whether or not they were a heretic. However, in some of the councils, some of the ecumenical councils, their doctrinal decisions were in part based on quotations from what they thought were church fathers, and
That's
it
correct.
actually turns out to be heretics.
Yeah.
So in some cases, they thought they were quoting a saint, and they may have actually been quoting Apollinarius. Here I'm thinking about the Third Ecumenical Council.
Right.
And that was used in justification for the Christological decisions.
Yeah.
Now, I think some might say, well, God writes straight lines with crooked sticks, and it's not the sources that are infallible, rather it's the definitive judgment and conclusion. Perhaps, but it is a difficulty that has to be acknowledged.
Now, one thing that I want to lay out, because people love to take quote bits from you, Michael, from me, from Erick, and they'll get a tiny little snippet. And with that tiny snippet, they will run wild. From the statement we've just made right now, there will be shows done about
No,
us.
this maps onto Eastern Orthodoxy. They hold to the Third Ecumenical Council. This is a problem for Orthodox as well.
Yeah.
No, it is 100%. But then they are then going to do a show, and they're going to say, look, William and Erick and Michael, they just said St. Cyril is a Christological heretic. Nobody is saying that. Nobody's
saying the conclusion is heretical. But
nobody is saying
sources, they misattribute it to other people. And
look, let's be very clear.
Council.
Let's be very clear. I want to be very clear. The first time hold on, let me just say this. The first time if we look at the Thesaurus Linguae Grece, and we look at a particular word that is used by St. Cyril, it's very clear where he's taking that from. It's from Apollinarius. It's not from Athanasius. That is he thought it was St. Athanasius, but you know very well, Michael, it came from Apollinarius. So that's something that needs to be discussed as well. And I find that too often, rather than discussing this issue, people get very defensive and say, well, no, he could have never made this particular error. Now are you saying he's a heretic because he made this error? We're not saying he's a heretic. We're saying that none of these early fathers are completely infallible in and of themselves. And clearly that was a mistake that he made. That was not Athanasius. If you look in any scholarly resource, that is pseudo-Athanasius. Am I right, Michael? That's Apollinarius.
Right, yeah. You have many cases where they're attributing it to one person. Turns out it was actually somebody else. They didn't know this at the time. This comes up very frequently, even at the Council of Florence. Erick, speak a little bit about that, some of the sources that are being used for these doctrinal conclusions and some of the tension there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because Apollinarius sounded a lot like Cyril in some of his statements. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why some of the people were against Cyril, was because of how close he was to Apollinarius. So So do you want to continue on Honorius or the sources for any particular theologian in defense?
Let's shift over, especially
Oh,
to
Achilles.
just sources in that situation. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
By the way, just very briefly, Michael, I don't know if a cord got moved, but your audio became very scratchy there.
Yeah, I'm gonna have some audio issues with rain pouring down incredibly
My
hard.
bad, brother.
And so
I thought it was a
I'm gonna
cord.
keep myself muted and let y'all
Got you.
talk a
I
little
thought
bit.
it was a cord.
Yeah, I hear you just fine. But yeah, so some of these sources on Honorius, first of all, Maximus's letters in defense of Honorius are absent from the Sixth Council. The source of John IV is absent from the Sixth Council, and I think that's unfortunate. Like I was saying before, I think that if those things were there at the council, maybe Maximus's reputation was not restored enough to make any effect. But certainly John IV would have had impact on the papal legates,
Sure.
And then when the documents get back to Pope Leo II, he just ratifies it. And it's bizarre to me how he's not aware of Pope John IV's defense of Honorius to the east. So the sources there they conflict, but it's in the realm of historical fact. It's not in the realm of doctrine. Leo II, somebody asked if this was negligence. If he kind of like Pope Leo II exonerates Honorius. I have trouble with that. As much as I'd like to go with that, it's a very rough defense because Leo wrote more than one letter. He wrote to Spain, 2 letters going to Spain. He wrote a letter to the emperor. He wrote a letter to the council. And then he wrote another letter. I can't remember off the top of my head where it was. It was to the west. I think somewhere in the west, somewhere in Rome, I think. And in all of those letters, he endorses the imperial decree of Emperor Constantine IV. And in that decree, it doesn't just say Honorius was condemned, and it doesn't say that he was negligent. It calls him the author. It calls him the author, and it even says that he was following Severus of Antioch, who at that time was bad news bear. He's the one that caused all that violent persecution in Egypt and Syria over the post-Chalcedonian schism. So for Leo if Leo was trying to cleanse the record of Honorius, he certainly would have not allowed those accusations to be read in both Latin and Greek by any of the recipients that he was writing to.
Yeah.
So I think, so that's, that right there is an issue. But then Leo, in one of his letters, says that Rome, up to his time, had been free of all blemish, that all of his Petrine successors had been free of all blemish. And you wonder where, and this is actually in the English now, in a Catholic University of America Press publication called Conflict and Negotiation, Greek, Latin, and Syriac letters. Pauline Allen and
I know that one.
her
was a
other
fascinating one.
Australian partner, I can't remember her name, but there's a letter there of Pope Leo II where he just out of nowhere pulls out the 50 caliber Desert Eagle and says that Rome, all of his predecessors have been faithful up to him. So again, it's like the light bulb wasn't going off. I hate to sound like I'm putting our fathers in the faith down. I'm not. I'm just trying to point out that we, their children, are having to comb through some of these things, and so you've got tension even in the letters of Leo II on Honorius. So when the Orthodox bring this up, they often don't know all of the intricacies that are involved, and rarely do they afford you the time, to really go through them.
And what do you make of Constantinople for saying that he taught heresy in the Acts? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up more than once, right? I mean, it comes up in a letter from the Patriarch of Jerusalem. It comes up in one of the letter. Oh no, it was one of the letters that Pope Hadrian, was it Hadrian II? Yeah, Pope Hadrian II. He was reading some of the accusations of Photius that went out from his little 867 encyclical, and Honorius was brought up, and so Hadrian was forced to account for that, and because he was saying, look, Rome has never been touched. Rome has never been touched, right? He goes on to this, very bold, Agatho-like confidence, but he has to deal with Honorius, and then he says, yeah, but even in the case of Honorius, Rome was not judged even in that case, because even though Honorius taught heresy, it was only with permission from Rome that Honorius was condemned.
So only Rome can sit in judgment of Rome. Only a living pope can judge a predecessor pope.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, we're talking about extreme form of monarchy here when it comes to
and it's even interesting because it's saying not just synodally there's a prohibition against judging, right, but whether in tracts or written or any kind of written format or even verbally, it seems to censure Photius for doing that, and it mentions how Dioscorus had previously done so, and so it prohibits any kind of judgment against Rome in any kind of form, synodally or not.
Yeah, again, we're talking bold proclamations, and but he doesn't shy away from the fact. So it's very strange. As very few people that I've met in my life that have recognized Hadrian II's claim there, where he speaks of papal supremacy, and he's unmistakable about the heresy of Honorius. Most people are on one side or the other, and yet we have a 9th century pope himself who's got both claims in both hands.
Exactly. Right. And that creates some significant tension. I think the only way to harmonize that is to kind of read into this. And it might be legitimate to read into it, I'm not saying. But what I'm saying is, either way, you kind of got to read into it and say, well, I guess on the one hand, he's talking about an indefectibility here that is promised to the see. And maybe what Honorius did here didn't actually touch on the Holy See. It's more of a private letter. Right. you got to read into it in some kind of way. And also, how can we speak of this as a private letter when it's clearly Sergius is writing to him in his official role, right?
Official capacity.
He's looking for a response officially, not from the Pope as a private theologian. He's looking for a judgment from the Pope as Pope.
Yeah, I think we kind of have to answer that, going beyond the very, in my opinion, dated arguments that, well, maybe it was a private letter. It was simply private, wasn't magisterial in any kind of way at all. I think we have to go beyond that and look at all of the language being used. Okay, if Honorius was not a heretic, why so many statements to the contrary? And very clearly, I think that, as you point out, Michael, I don't think it's maybe a reading into to come to a certain conclusion, but I find your conclusion to be a logical one. I don't think it is a stretching of credulity, if you will. I think that what you're doing there is you're gathering all of the facts. By gathering all of the facts, you come to this particular conclusion. Look, I want to be very honest, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, or you, Michael. As strong as I steelman the Orthodox position, no matter what, I do not find a credible way of dealing with these papal claims.
I don't see how they could account for it.
Not at all. I cannot, as strong as I steelman the position, because I've heard arguments on their side, and I don't mean from the typical online community. I mean from their top scholars, and
Right.
I don't find them to be, they're not sufficient answers.
And just to clarify, when I say read into, yeah, like you're saying, I'm not saying that this is illegitimate, and I'm not saying that it isn't the proper interpretation.
Right.
But what I am saying is they themselves aren't doing the heavy lifting and explaining how this is harmonizable. So you do have to look for more recent distinctions in this discussion on how the magisterium operates, and you have to map that onto what they're saying. And that might be totally legitimate, but I think you're having to do that kind of work since the council itself is not doing it. I'll give you a perfect example. Trying to harmonize Pope Francis on the death penalty with what some of his predecessors said on the death penalty. He just outright says this is harmonizable, this is consistent with the magisterium of the past. But he doesn't do the heavy lifting and telling you how.
Sure.
So you might have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting and trying to read into some of these previous texts on how what he's saying is harmonizable with it. I think that there's something analogous kind of going on here.
Yes. I completely
Yeah,
agree.
it's unavoidable. I mean, it's you know, you either learn to live with it or you got to live without it. And if you live without it, it puts you away from the whole scene of Christian history.
Right.
Yeah, I think the alternatives
great
at
point.
that point would be you're at that point you're looking at non-Christian sources or your options at that point. I don't think anybody within the Christian context escapes this difficulty, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, you could become a Platonist, you know, Neoplaton. I've seen people go out of they once they've had it with the laboratory of Christian tensions, they go to Neoplatonism. I've seen that.
Oh wow, just Neoplatonism, no religious flavor to it, just a philosophical paradigm, and that's it.
Yeah, Erick Pearl, one of the guys, big Palomar guy, you know, he's no longer Christian. He's Neoplatonist now.
Wow. No, I didn't realize that. That's fascinating. Yeah. Anyways,
I think the one
ahead.
thing that we're doing, I'm sorry, Michael, sorry for interrupting. I think the one
No,
thing
go
that
ahead.
we are doing is I think that we are giving a very fair assessment of the data before us. Look, the data can be very messy. Michael and Eric, you know, there's a lot of it too. This isn't a matter of simply sitting down and only reading one book. It's a matter of navigating through a lot of data. And I think what we've done is we've looked at the data because we've been talking about these topics for many years now, and then looking at the data and trying to be responsible with it to say, okay, these are real difficulties. To me, the dishonesty would be saying no difficulty at all, how easy it is to harmonize. No, I think the honesty is saying these are real difficulties. We look at the data, and at the end of the day, what makes the most sense to us is the Catholic position, and that is the position that you've got to adopt in order to make logical sense of these statements. And I think that, you know, that's the best that we can do, and I think that's what I think a good job is being done.
It's a complex thing, as you're pointing out. It's I don't know if y'all have ever seen one of the episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation where they're playing chess on multiple levels. There's like multiple layers to it. Instead of just one board, there's multiple, and it's like playing chess on multiple levels. You got to factor in so many data points, to try to come to some kind of coherent position. I think what goes on in most conversations, they're only accounting for a couple points of data and they're ignoring a whole bunch of other things that are in the conversation. And so while we have this conversation, there's going to be somebody in the chat or in the background who's like, but Michael, this and X, Y, and Z, and they're only considering one or two data points. And we're aware of those points, but we're also aware of other things and other guardrails and other data points that we have to factor in coming to a conclusion. And most people in this conversation, unfortunately, just are not aware of all the data points to come to some kind of legitimate conclusion.
And fortunately, there are certain voices that are contemporary to these events that afford us the solution. So, like, for example, the whole issue with Justinian and the letter of Ibas, Justinian even said, "Why are we worried about this letter?
Right.
Why? It was just like, what if Chalcedon did think it was Orthodox? It doesn't matter. We know what Chalcedon decided, right? But it was too much pressure against him, so he was forced to say that, oh, that letter in the 16th session was actually, or the 14th session was actually just a letter from the clergy of Edessa, like going against it was like gaslighting the entire Latin church on the 3 chapters. And so,
which is why a lot of them fell away, right? Temporarily.
Many of them
Yeah.
did. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also with Maximus, John IV, and then Anastasius, who says that, look, when it comes to heresy, it's got to be formal, it's got to be obstinate, in defense of Honorius. Well, we're just scooping ingredients from these guys in those centuries to help us solve the problems today.
Yeah. Yeah, and to
something,
add to
William?
that point, I want to add a little wrinkle to that point, because I know predominantly we touched upon Protestantism, we've touched upon Eastern Orthodoxy as well for the majority of the show, and the letter of Ibas came up, and I'm glad that it did, very briefly, because there's a lot of controversy still to this day over that and Chalcedon. But to our Oriental friends, you don't escape the papal prerogatives, particularly at Ephesus. And when we look at the papal prerogatives at Ephesus, we look at the Acts of Ephesus, and even before that, it's very clear the papal prerogatives are there. And what is unique and important is these papal prerogatives are biblical, and they are made and they're followed and believed by councils when the body is united, when the body is one. So at the end of the day, we and I say it with all due respect, we can put Oriental Orthodoxy on the table and Eastern Orthodoxy. And when we examine the papal claims that even they believed, or our Oriental friends, when we were united, that are largely denied today for reasons that I don't think hold up at all. Well, at the end of the day, Catholicism comes forward yet again. When we compare the papal claims and the prerogatives, papal supremacy flat out taught at Ephesus. There's no denial of that. And I've heard from their scholars how they deal with that, and our Eastern Orthodox friends. The papal prerogatives are very early on. Very early on.
And I want to touch on that since you're bringing it up here.
Yes.
And maybe you can bring up some of the ways they attempt to do so. But one might try to say, okay, when Philip the Legate at Ephesus, Third Ecumenical Council, is saying that the papacy and its headship and authority over the church is something that lasts forever. So Celestine reigns as a successor of Peter in this office forever. Some might try to read that as just hyperbolic language. But I think the problem is that's exactly what universalists do when they read texts in the Bible that speak about punishment enduring forever. They might try to say that, that's hyperbolic and it's just for a long period of time, but eventually they, and including the devil, will be reconciled to God. And so, I think a lot of people want to avoid that and avoid just going straight to the hyperbolic language there. They want to do that with scripture, but then they're willing to do that with councils. What do you think?
Let me touch upon that first, and I'll toss the football over to Erick. I completely agree with you. Look, when we look at the language, not only merely reading it, we read the Acts and we read what is meant to be followed and believed there. It is not simply hyperbolic or what people today would say is mere flattery, if you will. The language was meant to be taken literally. And that is clearly laid out there at that particular council. So what do our Orthodox in general, or Orthodox friends, do with that? I have heard their very best arguments, and I desire to continue hearing them, but I don't think they have a good resolution.
What are some of those arguments that you hear?
Well, the main argument that I hear nowadays has a lot to do with the fact that Rome went astray in terms of her Christology, and Rome adopted a heterodox Christology by abandoning the pristine Christology laid forth there, which is a Miaphysite Christology of St. Cyril. Now, I know we're going very deep into the weeds right now, but for the audience that are wondering, a lot of our Oriental friends will claim that we have lost those prerogatives, and there's a kind of transferability, as you brothers brought up, and a lot of that having to do with the fact that our Christology is heretical, essentially. But I don't think that works at all, particularly, number one, when we put the joint declaration of Christology on the table, which I don't think has been abandoned, as some of their individuals claim has been abandoned. Then if Christology is not the barrier that we once thought it was, I don't think that's a very good argument to say that our Christology is heretical. I think that and I'm being very, very kind here, I think that we can look at the Miaphysite language, and I don't know if Erick and you and Michael would agree, and we can look at the Diophysite language, and I think we're both trying to say the very same thing, perhaps utilizing different language and coming to the very same conclusion. And that doesn't come from me, in my opinion. That comes from Dr. Brock, who said it on the show that we did together. Those are his words. They're reconcilable. So if they're reconcilable, Michael, I've got to ask you, how did we lose the divine prerogatives then if our Christology is not a heretical one?
Yeah, especially in light of, again, Philip saying that this headship will be forever. They have to account for that ecclesiological dimension. And so they're going to have to, they can't keep this discussion in the realm of Christology alone. They're going to have to talk about that ecclesiological claim and account for it. Here we got a commenter pushing back and saying, wild position to take when your theology is based on Apollinarian forgeries. I think the difficulty, presumably this is an Oriental Orthodox speaking here.
No, he's Catholic. He is.
Okay.
He's actually pushing back on them and their claims.
Okay. I see what you're saying, because I was going to have to point out, but Ephesus is exactly the one that is struggling with that.
Yeah.
So
That's what I thought too.
Okay,
he's Catholic.
all right.
I've seen him before.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's my point, is you can't limit the discussion to a Christological conversation.
I'm with you.
In light of Ephesus making an ecclesial point about the papacy, one has to account for that language. Were the council fathers just asleep and they dozed off?
Right.
I've actually heard some, by the way, Eastern Orthodox try to account for the conciliar positions here by suggesting that. I don't take that seriously, but were they just dozing off and they just didn't hear that part from Philip, or were they just trying to be conciliar, pun intended, and just trying to say, you know what? Okay, well, we appreciate Rome's presence here, and we'll allow them to say this stupid stuff, and we're not going to push back because we're getting what we want Christologically. Yeah. Were they just kind of letting it slide, letting it pass because they need Rome on their side? I think that's a difficult solution too, because
not a good argument.
Appear to be a level of dishonesty. It's like, okay, I'm going to give you a pass in your heresy for ecclesiology just because it serves my end in Christology. That seems to impute some dishonesty to the.
Yeah, and if these guys are saints, why don't they just do that today and resolve the schism?
Yeah, there you go.
Right. One other thing I'd like to add, Michael, you brought up a great point for Philip the presbyter. I mean, as I'm reading it, and I've spoken to our Oriental friends, because we got a lot of phenomenal people over there, and as more and more that I read it, it has been known in all ages that the holy and most blessed Peter, prince and head of the apostles, pillar of the faith, foundation of the Catholic Church, received the keys to the kingdom of heaven from our Lord Jesus Christ, Savior and Redeemer of the human race, and that to him was given the power of loosing and binding sins, who down even to this day and forever both lives and judges in his successors. And then right after it says that, Michael, you're very well aware of this. You've looked at this many times. Right after it says that, it then identifies who one of the successors is. The holy and most blessed Pope Celestine, according to due order, is his successor and holds his place. This is a very difficult thing to reconcile if even Ephesus has the language that this is going to continue in perpetuity. I know we look a lot at later councils, but even Ephesus has this language, doesn't it, brothers?
And this is actually what Vatican I is citing.
It is.
So yes. whenever it's coming to its definitive judgment in ecclesiology, it's not getting it out of nowhere. It is referencing these things, and even Gasser's Relatio is referencing the Sixth Ecumenical Council and stuff like that. And so it's not coming out of nowhere. It's not in a vacuum. It is based upon some of these more foundational conciliar acts. And so for me, I would like to see some engagement with these points from both the Oriental Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox that factors for all of the data. All I tend to see, however, is a one-dimensional conversation and interaction on these points that doesn't account for all of the data. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, and this whole thing of flowery language, it comes up quite a bit. It's also undermined by the context, because when are people more prone to accept flowery language? It's when everybody's happy. But when people start getting annoyed, now we start like when people start talking about money, people start talking about business, like all that stuff goes out. And so this dovetails with Orthodoxy and the Oriental Orthodox. When Pope Julius I, who's a saint for the Copts, he's a saint for the Orthodox. When he found out that Athanasius was condemned, he wrote a letter to them saying, "Where have you ever heard of the See of Alexandria ever getting judged without letters from us?"
Yeah.
Like, and that really annoyed the Easterners. And it wasn't resolved until the Council of Sardica said, no, he's the successor of Peter. They said that he is the head of all the bishops. That's why he can restore Athanasius. So that flowery language goes out when there's conflict, annoyance, people losing money, they're losing time, they're losing their livelihood. You can't use that flowery language thing for the context.
That actually reminds me of Gregory the Great, right? He's going to say that Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, these Petrine sees, they're all equal in times when there's no dispute. But when there's a time of dispute, obviously they're not going to be equal. Of course, Rome is going to have primacy here. And so it reminds me of what we see in Gregory the Great there.
Yep.
Yeah, agreed.
I do see a couple of super chats. Let's grab those.
Definitely.
Okay, Enslaved by Truth says, the boys are back in town. I love it. Great. Well, good to see you all together again and teaching on the faith. Thank you. Precision Apologetics, good to see you three together. Hopefully many more in the future. God bless. Thank you. Polo Down. Yo, fam, please pray for me. I have bad sciatica. Oh, I know how that goes.
I know what that's like.
Yeah. Oh, do you too, Eric? Terrible, I'm sorry to hear that. That can be really, really rough. Hercule, good to see the crew back together. We're all back. Thank you, Rome. Okay, Lumen Gentium 25 speaks of the Pope speaking as a private person. Thus, not every word he says is infallible. Interviews, is that correct? Yeah, it does have that dimension where it makes those distinctions, although it doesn't really delineate them in a great deal of detail, but there is that aspect. But I think that is not necessarily fully accounting for the conversation that we're having here about Honorius. I don't think that you could just throw out the distinction between ex cathedra versus private person. There are other dimensions there in the exercise of the papacy, that there are middle positions there. And there's some other things going on with the letter from Agatho that I think doesn't reduce just the conversation to those two options. And I think we explored some of those here. Did y'all want to comment on that too?
I think we touched upon it earlier. I completely agree with you there. And I think that when we take it to the other level, we're taking it to a higher level, and it really is necessary, because the whole argument that he was merely speaking as a private person, I think when you actually read the letters, you're going to come to a little bit of a different conclusion there.
And but we can, as Eric's pointed out many times, the Pope wears many hats.
Oh yeah.
And so there are some hats that are above the level of speaking as a private theologian, but are still not him acting in his universal capacity, teaching capacity, even so when we speak of the Pope acting in his universal capacity as a universal shepherd, he can do so in two different ways. He could teach non-definitively or definitively. But even below that, there are other acts that he can act as Patriarch of the West merely, or just a metropolitan, or just a local bishop. that is higher than him acting as a private theologian, but lower than him acting in his capacity as a universal shepherd, teaching definitively or non-definitively. There's a lot of middle categories. Perhaps some of those are going on here. Maybe you can make your argument. But I think we have to be aware of those different dimensions, different capacities by which the Pope can act. That's between these two extremes of ex cathedra at the very top and private theologian at the very bottom. There's like a whole bunch of stuff in between.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
sure
You
is.
see all the 19th century writers. They're all just saying, "Oh, private or ex cathedra." It's like, come on, guys.
We don't even get the church talking about non-definitive yet authoritative teachings until the 1968-ish, and it comes oddly enough from German bishops, and so that's the first time we get this conversation about non-definitive acts of the Pope that are magisterial in nature. Prior to that, it's like just an on and off switch in the conversation. Either it's full ex cathedra, full plenary authority, or it's just nothing. He's just talking about a private theologian. There are so many more categories here, but they're not discussed until much, much later. I think we grabbed all of the super chats there. I want to thank y'all both for coming on and doing this. This is absolutely fascinating. Hope to do plenty more. I want to ask both of you to put in a plug for your own platforms and your own content and what y'all are currently working on. Starting with you, William. What you got going on there?
Well, let me say first off, I had a wonderful time being with both of you. It was great, and it felt like it was just the other day that we got together, and it was great. What a great time getting together, talking about Pope Honorius, Agatha, the councils, sacred scripture. It was great. It was phenomenal. I want to say I'm glad to be back with you, brothers. Hopefully we can do many more in the future, and I'd love to. It was great. Had a great time. In terms of what I'm working on, people can check me out over there at Patristic Pillars. I'm working on the usual, debating a whole lot. As Michael knows, I'm a debate junkie, man. I'm a debate junkie. And being a debate junkie, I'm going to have to be a debate junkie and give more debates to Michael, the host, for me. I'm going to have to do that in the future, man.
Hey, happy to do it.
I'm going to have to do that, man. Working on debates coming up. I'll be debating in the canon very soon. And working on new material. That'll be with T-Fen, That'll be with T-Fen. And that'll be fun, a lot of fun. And then, of course, working on finishing up our book on the perpetual virginity with Father Kappas. Been working on that for over a year now. We keep finding new stuff, but God willing, we'll be done with that hopefully in a few months. And in terms of anything else, people check out RNT, check out my channel. And, of course, Erick is doing a lot of great and phenomenal stuff as well. Just glad to be back with you, brothers. Look forward to it again, and look forward to hearing what Erick has to say.
Yeah, Erick, what you got going on?
Yeah, so I just published a small little book. It's kind of like a primer to the bigger book on the papacy. So anybody who wants to just do a quick, it's like a 2-hour reading at most. You can sit down, just read it in one night. That's on Amazon. It's called the logic of it's called oh my goodness, I can't even remember the name of my own book.
I get it.
Yeah, I think it's called The Early Papacy, or the Roots of the Papacy, the Patristic Logic. Yeah. I have a book that I'm going to be publishing soon on the atonement in the Church Fathers. That's going to be very fiery because I know a lot of my Orthodox readers and some of my Catholic readers, they're very sensitive to this issue. But it's going to be very small, easy to read. I'm also publishing a book on the sources and the quotations of my debate with Ubi Petrus, because a lot of people were just kind of lost, and I've got all my debate notes and everything. I just want that to go out so if people want to revisit that and ever look into the sources, they can have that. Besides that, classical Christian thought, I'm on Patreon, YouTube, I have a Substack, and that's basically it.
Erick, awesome. you told us about 2 years back that you were working on a project on divorce and remarriage. And
Yeah,
the
that's
fathers.
still ongoing.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, that's
Great.
that there is going to be it's not going to be that big, but it's going to be very it's people have known me to be I'm willing to be vulnerable to the data.
Mhm.
But I still think the sources are all pointing more in the Catholic direction.
Yes.
Even though there might be a call to moderation,
Mhm.
I think that's going to be a valuable resource, because in the English language we don't have really good patristic commentaries on this issue, specifically remarriage. Yeah.
And I look forward to reading that. Also, you're engaged with Basil's canons and stuff like that.
Yes, all that, Basil, and not just his canons, but his ethics. He's written on ethics. He brings up all over the place.
Yeah, that's going to be fascinating. I'll put, of course, link to both of y'all there in the chat. Everybody go and check those channels out and subscribe if y'all haven't already. I know many of y'all are already subscribed, but if you're not, go ahead and do so. And of course, also subscribe here if you don't mind. And hey, share this on your social media with all of your friends. Hit the like button so this episode can go far and wide. And looking forward to many, many more. We'll see you later. God bless.